Joining me is Adam Creighton, US correspondent for the Australian newspaper, who was in Uvalde today for the funeral. Adam Creighton, thank you so much for joining me. You're just back from the town. What did you notice there? What's the mood?
Well, it's an extremely shattered town, of course. This town of Uvalde, about 15,000 people, very close-knit. I spent about 10 hours there today, I suppose, just walking between the various memorials and talking to locals and talking to well-wishers who've come from all around Texas, actually, and indeed all around the United States. That's what really struck me, is that, you know, perhaps more than half of the well-wishers, I would say, have driven very long distances or flown in, even from as far as Kansas City, to pay their respects to this extraordinary tragedy. You know, some of the interesting things, I mean, I asked lots of these people what they think should happen now, what they think should change, and many of them don't want to talk about that yet. They're just still in the grieving phase. And indeed, just today was the first of the funerals of the 19 children. So extremely tragic. There's essentially in this small town two places where funerals take place, and so essentially for the next 2.5 weeks there'll be almost a funeral every day. And so this town is going to be reminded of this tragedy each day for the next 2 weeks. So it's certainly not over by any sense, by any stretch. And just the town itself, I mean, I was really struck. All of the Taco Bells, all of the Wendy's, all the McDonald's, the Pizza Huts, they all had signs out the front, you know, about praying for Uvalde strong. There was a tremendous sense of community there, and some businesses actually had shut down for the day, and they'd set up stalls to hug people. There was quite literally a hug station that a pie store from a nearby city had set up, and some of the local trucking companies had also set up free burgers for visitors and for locals. So there was an extraordinary sense of community there. I was really struck by it.
It's interesting, isn't it? When President Biden visited a couple of days ago, there was a video of someone in the crowd shouting, "Do something," presumably do something in gun control. But I'm not sensing any burning anger or anything like that. It just seems to be a sort of quiet grief and a wanting to come together from what you've described.
Look, I think that's right. People were not that willing to talk about gun reform. They were saying it was too early. But certainly I did, you know, I spoke to the local attorney there, for instance, and you know, he was saying that he was optimistic that there would be some change now, because of course we've had 2 massacres in a fortnight in the United States. So that does create a lot of momentum, if you like. And a couple of people said to me, if nothing changes now, nothing ever will change. But just, you know, going back to Washington for a bit, you know, I think there is a mood maybe for some change, but of course, you know, change is only going to be at the margins. It's going to be, you know, it's going to be very much at the edges, whether it's, you know, particular classes of weapons that are banned, or perhaps a tinkering with the age of people who can buy weapons. It's certainly not going to be anything like we saw in Australia. I mean, you know, one thing that did strike me, you know, probably 7 of the 10 people I spoke to are still very much in favour of Second Amendment gun rights here. I mean, even in this town, people don't have an issue with the Second Amendment. They have an issue with the availability of certain types of weapons to young men of certain ages, but certainly the issue of guns in general, people do support Second Amendment rights here.
No, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the Uvalde horror is quite stark. But meanwhile, of course, in a city like Chicago, what have they had? 250, 260 murders just this year already, most by guns. And that sort of goes almost unremarked. That's just one city. One issue that really struck me, Adam, was that for 40 minutes or more, you had armed police standing outside the barricaded room with this gunman. He was still in there, still alive, including some children still alive, children who were even ringing 911 for help, and they didn't go in. That I find truly shocking.
Oh, look, it is shocking. And in fact, the first funeral today of a young 10-year-old girl she was actually one of the people who were calling 911. And so, she got through at some point and she was later shot. Extremely tragic. So there was a lot of discussion about this. And we don't know all the facts yet, but certainly, as you suggest, it was far too long a time. There were multiple law enforcement agencies there outside the classroom. And actually, just 30 minutes ago, I was talking to a Texas policeman outside who was on holidays in San Antonio, and he came up to me and he didn't realize I was a journalist. But then we got talking about what happened, and he was saying through his networks that he believed that there was somewhat of a mutiny kind of outside the classroom by some of the agencies who disagreed with the decision of the commander at the time, the commander of the Uvalde police force. He was the person who had the highest authority there, and in his judgment, which in hindsight was an extremely erroneous judgment, this was a barricade situation, which meant that they had a lot of time. It meant that no one was vulnerable inside, but of course it was not. It was still an active shooter situation, as we know now. And police are trained, as this policeman was telling me just outside before, they are trained that in an active shooter situation, you have to assume that every 30 seconds someone is going to be shot. And so the highest priority is to get to the shooter as soon as possible. And yet, as you say, there was that 45-minute gap, and the police, for some reason, did not shoot the door open. They waited for the keys from the janitor. It's extremely hard for people to fathom how this happened. And so I do think that a lot more is going to come out about this. It's obviously a very sensitive issue for the police force here. Many of them are ashamed, embarrassed, and there's certainly a lot of anger directed to them. But I don't think we're going to see the full extent of that anger until the grief phase, if you like, of this tragedy passes.
And Creighton, thank you so much for your report. Really appreciate your time.